So good evening, everyone. It's a big pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the audience. Okay, I'm so glad to see you here. I'm Dr. Emílio Ribeiro, professor at the Universidade do Estado do Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil. And in the series Gothic Dialogues, I will be receiving friends, professors, theorists, filmmakers, critics to discuss Gothic in literature and in other artistic expressions, okay? So it's gonna be like a dialogue in which we'll be raising questions about Gothic, okay? In the end, if time allows, I may choose some of the audience's questions so that they are answered, okay? And in the end, I will also raffle a copy of my book, Gótico e seus monstros. In English, it will be Gothic and its monsters, for the ones who live in Brazil, okay? So if you want to take part of the raffle, click on the form in the description of the live and fill it to compete for the book, okay? And for the first episode of Gothic Dialogues, we have the pleasure to dialogue with Unutterable Joshi, better known as St. Joshi, okay? Joshi is an Indian-American writer, a musician. He plays the violin very well, and a critic and award-winning scholar whose extensive work focused on weird, Gothic, fantastic fiction, including publications about, for example, Arthur Machen, Blackwood, Dunsany, M.R. James, Ambrose Bierce, Shirley Jackson, and many others, okay? And including, obviously, H.P. Lovecraft. So among his main works is Unutterable Horror, A History of Supernatural Fiction, a wonderful book. It's in the description. Its name is in the description of the video. Okay, the book is marvelous. It presents a very complete history and analysis of the weird, the supernatural fiction from antiquity to the present day. Okay, another one of Joshi's book is Lovecraft's biography, I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft. So Joshi has been a very prolific publisher and editor of works on weird, fantastic Gothic by various authors and a historian of the field across a large number of volumes. He also wrote, happily, the preface of my book, Gótico e seus monstros, which will be published at the beginning of the year, okay? So be welcome, Joshi. It's a very big pleasure to have you here.
Wonderful to be here from Seattle, Washington, in the U.S.
Very nice, Joshi. Today we're going to have, as you have just heard, a talk about Gothic, yeah, in literature and in some other artistic expressions. I don't know what you have there for me, but I have some important topics to be discussed here, and allow me to start with a very introductory topic about the conception of Gothic fiction. What is Gothic fiction in your point of view? Because here we have students that are undergraduate students, we have masters, we have doctors, we have fans of Gothic fiction, Gothic movies, graphic novels, and we know that it's not that easy. So what is Gothic fiction in your point of view, and what is the monster's role in Gothic fiction?
Very, very difficult question. We could go on the whole topic just on this question. In the first place, I myself believe that the term Gothic fiction really should only be applied to those early works, late 18th, early 19th century, that were called the Gothic novel. Now, I believe you are using the term more widely, which is fine, and many people do that. So I think that's the basis of your question. And, I devoted a long time to determining what distinguishes this kind of literature from what in the English-speaking world is called mainstream literature, the literature of social realism, Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, things like that. What distinguishes Gothic or weird fiction from that kind of literature? Well, a number of things. First of all, it could, although it doesn't always have to, it could include the supernatural. the very element of the supernatural contradicts or is opposed to the social realism of the, Hemingway and those writers, because they were concerned purely with the real. It's what is called the mimetic fiction, a fiction that imitates reality. Lovecraft himself says the one distinguishing quality of the weird is that it departs from the weird, from mainstream, from realism, and depicts something which could not possibly happen. A ghost, the werewolf, the vampire, and more nebulous things like that. All these entities and situations could not happen in the real world and are understood by both the author and really the readers as, an impossible event. So the craft of the weird fiction writer is to devise a scenario that makes these kinds of situations believable to the reader. It's what Coleridge, in a slightly different context, called the willing suspension of disbelief. And the monster does play a critical role in this, with the understanding that very few authors of weird fiction believe in the literal reality of their work. Lovecraft did not believe in the literal reality of Cthulhu. Cthulhu was an invention, and he knew it. The Necronomicon is an invention. Of course, many people think the Necronomicon exists out there. Of course, it doesn't. And many people have made fake Necronomicons and published them as such. But this is unreal. Therefore, what these phenomena, what these monsters indicate, they are symbols. They are symbols for what the author is trying to convey through the medium of the weird. For example, Anne Rice, great writer of vampire stories. As I read her work, it seems to me that for her, the vampire is a kind of symbol for the social outsider, for the gay person or somebody like that who doesn't fit in to normal society. A lot of her work is based upon that scenario. For Lovecraft, all his various entities, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, whatever, are symbols for the unknowable. He says the greatest horror that we can envision is the fear of the unknown. There's a huge universe out there, and we've only probed a little bit out into it, and so again, he's not thinking that Cthulhu actually exists, but it's a symbol for everything we do not know about the universe.
Very nice. Would you like to add something about the monster, or the monster is that unknowable you have just said?
Well, as I say, I mean, it's interesting how many of these monsters, the ghost, the witch, the werewolf, even have very long pedigrees. They go back to antiquity and into the dimmest folklore. And it's interesting, the French critic Maurice Lévy, whom I greatly admired, I translated his book on Lovecraft into English. He says the weird does have a backward-looking focus. It draws upon this folklore, this myth, to create its weird effects, because these myths have entered so deeply into human psychology. We don't really believe them anymore, but so we sort of do in some ways. That vestigial belief is still there. That's what triggers this suspension of disbelief when the well-crafted weird tale creates a scenario that populates their stories with these entities.
Very nice. Hujine is a watcher. He said it doesn't happen in real world, unfortunately.
Well,
it does sometimes, but the monsters from the real world, they are some other ones.
Well, we can at some point, maybe not now, but we can discuss the whole idea of non-supernatural fiction, and there is such. Ambrose Bierce was a great master of the non-supernatural horror tale, where the horror is created by simply human evil and whatever. But and that can be very powerful too. Lovecraft didn't really care for that because he felt that emotionally and also metaphysically, it was secondary. For Lovecraft, what he felt was the most quintessential element of horror or fear was the defiance of natural law. We have reached a stage where we have a pretty good understanding of natural law. Of course, there's always, gaps in our knowledge of the world and the universe, but entities that defy natural law totally upset our understanding of what it is to be in this universe. And that is tremendously frightening. It really is a very alienating and disturbing aspect, more so than merely a serial killer or somebody like that. It's a very natural thing, and it's obviously you don't want to be subject to a serial killer, but that kind of metaphysical fear is absent in those tales of non-supernatural horror.
Very nice. Noah Carey, he talks about that when he classifies natural horror and art horror in his book Paradoxes of the Heart, the Philosophy of Horror.
The main title is The Philosophy of Horror, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
very nice.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a question. In terms of, what does make a literary work Gothic? What is the role of the Gothic monster in that work?
So you are just having your revenge now, yeah?
Yeah, that's another good question.
I agree totally with what you said. It's so complicated to define Gothic. Yeah, Gothic involves different genres. We have poetry, cinema, comics, drama, and Gothic changes from time to time, from space to space. So that's why today it's quite complicated to reduce Gothic to a specific definition. I've read that in one of your books. And I've seen that in one of your interviews also. You're talking about the risk that we have when you categorize Gothic in a way that its themes, its stories are stereotyped, and in a way that the aspects usually related to Gothic, for example, the marvelous, the weird, supernatural, science fiction, they are excluded from Gothic's big scope. So it's dangerous. In this sense, in my point of view, answering your question, the word Gothic would apply in a general way as a reference to all of these things: horror, weird, supernatural, splatter, terror, slasher, thriller, and whose themes explore the aesthetics of fear. Fear in the face of, for example, decay, which is the case of lots of characters in Edgar Allan Poe, for example, his work, in the face of death, in the face of a threat. I'll talk about that after. And the relationship between fantasy and reality. You talked about the supernatural and fantasy. So in this case, Gothic exceeds a genre. It's a style because it's in all these types or types of text. So if we take into account graphic novels, video games, movies, literature, which are considered Gothic, we'll see they show in general, among other aspects, three main ones. And you said that we have the one of them is the dark place, the environment, the oppressive, or not only cemeteries, but or castles, which we see in the old literature from the Castle of Otranto, for example, and the underground passages. But we see dark, oppressive environments in domestic contexts, for example. As you can see in many female Gothic works. In Julia Lopes de Almeida, who is a very good Brazilian writer, female Gothic writer, in Shirley Jackson's work. So the second point would be the form of manifestation of horror, something that embodies that horror. So which can be what you have just said, supernatural, some abnormality, some deviations, facts that contradict our notion of what is real. And the monster, the monster embodies horror. And the third and last thing would be the effects of this monster or any other manifestation or on the characters and on the interpreters, the viewers. And that includes the threat, because you also asked about the monster. The monster is a threat. Yeah, and you can even add something about that after, because the monster about the monster, I observed that becoming monstrous often comes from not accepting following social, political, or religious standards. You said it, not fitting gay people, for example. They don't fit a place. They don't fit a group. They don't belong to a group. So Gothic monster represents this threat, physically or sometimes morally, socially. The monster threats patterns. And Noel Carroll reminds about that in his book, The Philosophy of Horror. Monsters, for example, the Cenobites from Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Yeah? They are disturbing creatures that are part of a religious order dedicated to sadomasochistic experiences and tortures, etc. They are impure, given the repulsion they provoke. So they represent a threat to the physical and mental integrity of the characters. Dracula by Bram Stoker is threatening. He doesn't belong to nor the living nor the dead. So he stands there on the border between life and death. He transgresses the limits accepted by the social. Coming more to the present, Toni Morrison's, the Pulitzer Prize winner, she wrote a novel called Beloved. Beloved brings the horrors of American slavery in the 19th century. So the past can be considered the monster, which comes back to torment the protagonists. The emphasis is on the exploration and exorcism of this threat, the oppressive, destructive elements that involve the ghosts of the past. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the distinction between Gothic or weird literature and, we can call it mainstream literature, non-weird literature, may not be as great as we think it is, because many, serious literature on of both sorts are still trying to make some statement about the human condition, the human being, and his place in the universe. They just use different methods to do so. I mean, there's some literature, this type of literature, Gothic weird, used to be dispensed with or disregarded as just escapist literature. These things don't really exist. You're just playing around with these things. They're not serious literature, but they can be. I mean, maybe there is a lot of, bad Gothic weird literature, but the great literature of this field says a lot about human beings, but uses the supernatural, uses these devices to convey their conceptions in a far more powerful way, to my mind, than mainstream literature can do. So that's why I'm attracted to this field.
Yeah, that's it. So if a student of mine asks me, I'm sweating. If a student of mine asks me about what is the monster, I usually say that in general terms, the monster represents a threat, because it may be the Black people who are monstralized many times in the centuries, so that their differences are erased and stigmatized. Or it may be the patriarchal society, which oppresses and endangers female dignity and freedom. It depends on the perspective. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah.
Would you like to say something? Yeah.
I was going to say it's interesting in that early Gothic fiction of late 18th, early 19th centuries, before Poe, basically, the monster was not what we conceive of today as the monster of the blood dripping and the gore and all that sort of thing. It was basically a human being who, as you say, transcended the bounds of normal humanity. That's why one of the great themes in that early Gothic literature was the quest for eternal life. Very powerful theme. That's why we see it in Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Maturin or Maturin, I'm not sure, but great Irish writer. Melmoth the Wanderer, which Lovecraft thought was the culmination of the whole Gothic movement, and in that sense he was right.
Yeah, that's it.
But this person, and in a way, Shelley's Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein. Who is the monster in that story? Is it Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, or is it the Frankenstein, the creature? I don't believe Mary Shelley ever calls him a monster. He doesn't call she always refers to as the creature, because it is something that Victor Frankenstein has created, out of the pieces of dead figures. And in fact, in many ways, he is a sympathetic figure because he is thrown out into the world, and is completely isolated and alienated from the rest of society and doesn't know how to deal with that. Is Victor Frankenstein the real monster? Because he has taken on, the subtitle for that book is very interesting. Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Now, what does that mean? Prometheus in Greek mythology, well, it had two different functions. First, both of them, both in bringing fire to human beings and also in creating human beings out of clay or something like that, defied the will of the gods. That's the important thing in that novel. Victor Frankenstein is defying God and nature, if you will, by creating living flesh out of dead matter. So, in a sense, he's a human being, and he's a scientist, but in some ways, he's a kind of sorcerer. He comes from a long tradition of sorcery that creates something out of nothing, and maybe he's the greater monster than the lumbering Hulk that we think of.
That's it. So it really depends on how we read. Renata says here, trespassing frontiers is also monstrous. So It depends on how you read, Renata and Joshi. For example, there are some female Gothic theorists today, very contemporary, including Susan Becker or June Pullian. June Pullian, yeah. They read the old female Gothic works, but in a different perspective. Mm-hmm. So some of them call those readings post-feminist Gothic. So it depends on how you read. The same characters that were considered the monsters now can be seen as victims, or vice versa. So it depends. Yep. Joshi, I now coming more to the living the concept of Gothic. Yeah, we know that as a genre, Gothic emerges in the 18th century when the writer Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto. Yeah, in 1764. So in general terms, how would you describe, because we have lots of Gothic elements before Horace Walpole, we know that.
Oh, yes.
So in general terms, how would you describe the experience of reading the manifestations of Gothic in literature works written before the Castle of Otranto? I mean, how were they important as your first influences in the reading and critic of Gothic literature itself?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because as I just mentioned before from Maurice Levy, the motifs of what came to be considered Gothic fiction go way back in time. We have instances of vampires and witches and werewolves and all sorts of other things in remote antiquity. Going all the way back. This is why my history of supernatural fiction, I'm holding up if I can see the first volume here, starts with the Epic of Gilgamesh, from 1700 BC, because even that it's a fragmentary work, I believe, from Assyria or Babylonia. I've forgotten now, somewhere in the Middle East, almost 2 millennia before Christ. Even that work has elements of what we later considered to be Gothic. There's a trip to the underworld. There are monsters there. Gilgamesh himself is a kind of superhero, the ultimate descendant of all the comic superheroes that we're familiar with now. I take a particular interest in Greek and Latin literature because I myself studied that in college. I didn't study English literature, interestingly enough, because for various reasons, I won't go into that, but I fell in love with the ancient classics of Greek and Latin literature and learned those languages. And when you read things like Homer's Odyssey, with its incredible proliferation of very strange entities, the Polyphemus, the Cyclops, the Lystragonians, Scylla and Charybdis, what an incredible imagination. Who knows where it came from? There probably was no one figure named Homer, of course. This was all oral tradition handed down over centuries. But the incredible imagination of the Greeks to come up with these entities. And of course, they were careful to place them far away from their homeland, because it's like, oh well, we don't see any such things here, but maybe if we go out there somewhere far to the east, maybe we'll find them, or something like that. Greek tragedy is very interesting, because we have the first emergence in literature, I think, or at least among the first, of ghosts. Aeschylus wrote the great play called The Persians, which is really fundamentally about the Greeks' defeat of the Persians in around 480 BC or something like that. And it has the spirit of Xerxes, the great Persian ruler, emerging. It's tremendous, and he's a ghost essentially. And throughout ancient literature, you have these elements here. And of course, then you go up to modern day or more recent times. Look at Shakespeare, the ghost in Hamlet. To my mind, for example, Macbeth is actually a horror play. It is a play full of horror. I mean, not just murder and things like that, but there are elements of the supernatural. There are elements of psychological horror in there. If you study my analysis of this, there are times when both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth think they're seeing a ghost, but it's from the context you can tell that it's just in their minds, which is a classic mode of psychological horror. In that same era, you have Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, which again is a horror play from beginning to end. The quest for all-encompassing knowledge and eternal life by summoning the devil. So these antecedents of the Gothic novel are really quite fascinating. Of course, they're haphazard in the sense that they were not working in a recognized tradition, but clearly elements of what we call the supernatural now were a legitimate part of literature at that time. And it must have had a tremendous effect. I would love to have seen how the initial viewers in the Globe Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon reacted to the ghost of Hamlet appearing on stage. So you can see the kernels, the little hints that many writers in the Gothic tradition then drew upon in this prior literature.
Yeah, that's it. It's not. I think it's unfair to consider. Sometimes it's unfair to consider Gothic only from Horace Walpole on. So because we have lots of things. Anglo-Saxon literature, we have Beowulf.
Yes.
Beowulf is a monster. So you said Macbeth, which can be read as a Gothic story. Mm-hmm. So we have many of us, Christopher Marlowe, as you said.
Yeah.
And a good thing is you have just said in the end of your talk, you said how these old non-Gothic words, but Gothic words, how they influenced the literature that were considered Gothic. So what are the connections we can? Yeah,
well, what I was going to say, what I say in my book is the true literature. Okay, first of all, let's consider that Gothic. The word Gothic. What does that mean in this context? These novels, Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe's novels, Melmoth the Wanderer, they were called Gothic because they were set in what in England was called the Gothic era. That is to say, the time when Gothic architecture flourished. The term Gothic really applies to architecture originally, right? The great castles and cathedrals throughout Europe and England in the Middle Ages. They were considered Gothic because of that was the designation for that kind of architecture. And that came to also refer generally to the medieval age, which was believed to be an age full of superstition and not a good grasp of scientific reality, if you want to call it that way, and things like that. And so by the 18th century, in Europe, at any rate, scholars, philosophers, writers had a much better understanding of what is real, what is not real, what is natural, what is not supernatural. I maintain in my book that the true genre could not have emerged until there was some sort of rough clarity as to what is real and what is not, because the sense of horror, that comes from depicting something that is not real, that is weird, that is supernatural, would not have an effect if people thought it actually was capable of happening. It wouldn't have that kind of emotional effect. But once we recognize that there really are no such things as ghosts or vampires or witches or werewolves, then their emergence in a good piece of literature can be truly terrifying.
Very nice. Very good.
Moving on, we got to go. Lovecraft, as you know, I've made my life's work of Lovecraft, and I could go on about it, but I want to solicit something from you about Lovecraft. He himself, we don't need to go into his racial views, although there have been lots of discussion about those. But we often see in Lovecraft that his protagonists have a repulsion to certain people, but then a weird sort of attraction to it. And what do you make of that this contradictory view that characterizes his and how does that relate to his major theme of cosmic horror?
This is ambivalent, isn't it? How can characters have attraction at the same time repulsion? So I see it as a kind of instinctive feeling, a mixture of fear and attraction that accompanies every individual, and that confirms a kind of a conviction, a human conviction about the world, about the fact that the world has something which is unknown. The world holds vast unknown forces. So it's a kind of conviction. So such simultaneous, I'd say ambivalent tendency, Joshi, to attraction and to repulsion prevents the monster. And that's the point. It prevents the monster from being categorized, analyzed in a very, very simple elementary logic. It is an ambivalent relationship. The object, we call it sometimes objection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Kristeva talks a lot in her article about the objection. So yes. the object monster is rejected by the human being, but human beings, they come from the object. So the ambivalence of repulsion and attraction, it happens due to what you have said before, to the unknowable, to the unknown aspect, and also the object aspect in the case of Lovecraft's monsters. So this attraction, it often comes from the discovery or sometimes the suspicion about common biological bonds, links between the protagonists and the monsters other. I'm referring to Lovecraft's tales especially.
Yeah.
So, and these bonds, these links, these relations, they which connect the inhabitants of the earth and make them avoid accepting a kind of relation to these monsters, and at the same time unconsciously makes them desire a deep knowledge about the other different in their culture. So what causes objection, Joshi, is that which puts identity, the system, the order at risk. In the case, for example, of The Shadow over Innsmouth, it's one of my favorite tales. Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yes.
We see that the character, I don't remember if he has a name. I'm afraid he doesn't.
Not in the story, but in notes he has given a name, but in the story itself he isn't. Very interesting.
Very nice. Yeah. For example, he is the narrator, and then he has the impression that those monstrous physical appearances that he sees in the bus and on the street, they suggest some distant memory, maybe a memory which he doesn't recognize, maybe clearly. Maybe it comes from a book, he has seen it in a dream. So the attraction is associated with a feeling of familiarity, but which is not clear, which is not defined memory. As a result, what do we have? We have a feeling of repulsion for that people of Innsmouth in this tale, and the repulsion coexists with a strange desire to stay there, to learn more about those people, those elements. It's what we call the uncanny. I mean, that effect. yeah, which is so recurring in several of tales written by Lovecraft and that integrate the Cthulhu mythos. Yeah, in his universe, that attraction also draws attention to the incompleteness of the human being, because we ignore our own origin and in our relation with monstrosity in his tales. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, that story really is incredibly fascinating and on so many different levels. You know, a lot of people have said, "Oh, that the chase scene, you know, where the monsters are trying to capture that narrator as he tries to escape from that hotel and then leave the city. What is their real objective? We don't really know. But I think the narrator thinks, oh, they're just trying to kill him. But no, I don't think so. They were actually trying to capture him and bring him into the fold, because I think they recognized somehow that he is one of them. He doesn't realize it yet. He only realizes it at the end, when he researches his family history and realizes that he actually had an ancestor from Innsmouth. And then of course, when he wakes up in the morning, that one morning, you know, sometime later, maybe years later, and said, "Oh my God, I have the Innsmouth look," you know, of that phrase, the Innsmouth look. Oh, it's incredible. And then he says, "Oh, I have to go back now." You know, he's drawn back to the city of his origins. Very, very powerful. You know, and I'm also the story that he wrote just before that, At the Mountains of Madness, which to my mind is his greatest accomplishment. In some ways, is somewhat similar, because what we find there is these explorers to the Antarctic discover this, you know, extraterrestrial species called the Old Ones. That's what they call them, who turn out to be the creators of all Earth life, including humanity, right? And yet, you know, they themselves get overthrown by these one of their own creations, the Shoggoths. And at the end, the narrators, or the main narrator, William Dyer, says, whatever those old ones were, they were men. Of course, he uses men, you know, in the sexist language, but that's okay. He means human beings. There is nevertheless an intimate connection between those horrible creatures, or they look, you know, very alien, and they are alien, as originating from somewhere else. And yet there is this weird connection there, not only from their having created us, but because there's a certain moral connection, because they are trying to, you know, maintain a civilization, and we're trying to maintain our civilization, and yet here are the Shoggoths who managed to overthrow them. So all these things are very, very complex in Lovecraft.
Yeah, and I said that this attraction also draws attention to the incompleteness of the human being. It reminded me of a text I read once. I don't remember the author. If I do, I'll tell you. But it made a reflection. It was an Italian one, but I read it in English. It made a reflection about the myth of Oedipus, the Greek myth of Oedipus. Because when he faces the Sphinx, and he has to answer that question, and he does it very well. He does it just half of it. He doesn't know the whole answer, but it is enough for him to survive and to become the king of Thebes, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, but the answer is the man, the human being. The one who in the morning walks with 4 legs, and in the afternoon 2 legs, in the evening 3 legs. But in that reflection that is made by this author, he says he just answers it partially, because he doesn't consider that the answer is the man, and he himself is the answer. Since Oedipus in the Greek origin of the word means Oedipus, which means both the one who walks using 2 legs, Oedipus, podes, comes from Latin words, it means podes. And also, so it means the man. And who is the man who is answering that question? It's he himself. So That's it. So he doesn't know the origin of his name. So we never know where we come from. I mean, considering the universe, the force is God, any divine force. So he just answers partially because he doesn't know the whole meaning of that answer. That's how we see the monsters. I just made a connection between both. Sorry. That's it. Very nice. I have a question for you as we're talking about Lovecraft. Yeah. Again, Noah Carroll's in his book, The Philosophy of Horror, Paradoxes of the Heart, he wrote that in 1990, if I'm not wrong. Lovecraft's bet on cosmic fear and as a defining characteristic of horror literature or weird fiction, in fact, seems to be a matter of establishing his preference for a certain aspect as the criterion for belonging the genre. I mean, do you think that Lovecraft confuses what he considers a high level of achievement in the genre with what identifies the genre? Do you think that every work to be considered weird or Gothic has to should have that kind of those elements that he points as belonging to the weird fiction?
I think Carroll and maybe others too have exaggerated the degree to which Lovecraft vaunts cosmic horror as the ultimate expression of horror. Of course, that's what the kind of literature he wanted to write and did write. But I think Lovecraft had a very Catholic taste. He was always looking for interesting instances of weird supernatural fiction. And if you read supernatural horror literature carefully, in fact, not even so carefully, even though it's funny, he mentions the word cosmic, he throws the word cosmic in a lot in situations that perhaps don't really warrant it. I mean, he thought that Melmoth the Wanderer was the first work of cosmic horror. I have grave doubts about whether that's an accurate assessment or not, but this thing about the quest for eternal life has a long pedigree. In fact, Lovecraft himself wrote a novel about that, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which really is his ultimate tribute to the old-time Gothic fiction. But you see, even in that work, that he is appreciative of Poe, who really isn't very cosmic. Ambrose Bierce is really not cosmic at all. In fact, wrote relatively few tales of overt supernaturalism. Bierce, as Lovecraft recognized, was a pioneer in psychological horror. This is why, in my estimation, even his tales of the Civil War are, in many cases, instances of psychological horror. They're not mainstream literature in the standard sense of the term, because the elements of fear and terror are predominant all throughout. And in many cases, there are clear parallels between what happens in the Civil War stories and what happens in his more overtly horrific stories. So Lovecraft did appreciate many different types of literature, but what I think his emphasis on the cosmic, what that meant was, my Harold Bloom, who was a great influence on me. In fact, I knew him personally because he worked at a publishing company that I worked at in the 80s and 90s. Bloom, of course, wrote his great treatise called The Anxiety of Influence, that writers are always trying to overcome their influences in a sort of Freudian, sort of way. I'm not sure I buy that entirely, but clearly the weight of influence is something. And Lovecraft, who was so thoroughly well-read in weird fiction. In fact, one critic said he was too well-read, that he read so much that everything came out as sort of an imitation, which is not at all the case. But in any case, I think Lovecraft was aware of the vast heritage of weird fiction, and he wanted to come up with something of his own. How can I express myself in a way that hasn't been said before? And he seized upon cosmic horror for his own type of writing. And to be sure, he really was a pioneer in that field. I mean, hard to find examples before him. Perhaps William Hope Hodgson in House on the Borderland, but Lovecraft didn't read that work until almost the end of his life. So he really is a pioneer in cosmic horror. And toward the end of his life, we find him saying, I just don't find the cosmic in Poe and Bierce and even Dunsany and other writers like that. So he was trying to make this corner of the field his own. But nevertheless, he did have a wide appreciation for work that was not cosmic and praised it very highly in some cases.
Yeah, I also see it that way, because he mentions Edgar Allan Poe in his book, and he seems to like lots of other literatures which are not cosmic horror. You mentioned Amber's Verse. It's very, you know what? I think the main thing that he considers to be that would take part of a good literature, horror literature, would be the atmosphere, as you said, because that's what we have in both Poe and Amber's Verse.
Yes.
The first contact I had with Amber's Verse, and I know you are a big fan of his works, it was in Twilight Zone, the one not the one black and white, but the one presented by Forrester Whitaker. the second season, because now we have a third one. And if I'm not wrong, it was Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And that's very psychological. Everything is in the character's mind.
Yes.
There's nothing there about cosmic horror.
Absolutely.
So they really exaggerate in that critic of Lovecraft's work. That's it.
Speaking of Lovecraft, I mean, a lot of it is made about his racism, but do we think that those fears that Lovecraft had about the alien, the other, do they apply to our own time in the 21st century, whether in life or in literature?
Oh, this is a very good question, and it's not easy. How can we? You want to know how can we read his fears, these monsters, if we consider the fears and anxieties of the 21st century? Time changes. Monsters change somehow, but some cultural paradigms referring to the construction of monsters, sometimes they are maintained. In today, in the 21st century, many discourses promoted by the mass media and their hegemonic devices, and we saw that during American elections, for example, they are based on dichotomies of modernity. They oppose minority groups to the dominant ones and associating them with the evil, the minorities, and the terrifying. So it is the critical reaction of the hegemonic group that dictates almost always the parameters of evaluation of a production, literary or film. So in this sense, based on a modern thought, not postmodern, the different bodies, you mean the gay ones, the black, homosexuals, women, Gothic literature, they are still reserved a place outside borders, as they represent a threat to a purity, to an essence, truth, pattern, religious truth. So they differ. And when they differ, they are transgressors. They are part of a renegade and monsters group. That's why they tend to be controlled by the hegemonic. And one of these forms of control, Joshi, is by erasing differences, in my point of view. For example, in a false egalitarian democratic discourses, in Brazil, we have that. We are all the same people. We have the same color. No, we don't have the same color. We have black people, and they deserve different politics because they were treated differently since slavery. So the monstrous other, I'll get to your answer. This is just an introduction. The monstrous other, whose body is a threat due to its difference, needs to be eliminated. Okay, so Jack Halberstam, he has a very interesting book. It's called Skin Shows. Gothic Horror and Technology of Monsters. Skin Shows. The title itself says lots of things. Skin Shows. It talks about how Gothic monsters represent many answers to the question of who should be removed from the community, from the wider community. So answering your question, the traumas and the apprehension that Gothic evokes nowadays, it's very similar. They are very similar in some aspects to the feeling involved in the literary works and films, usually, in the early 20th century when Lovecraft wrote. Just like in the 20th century, in some contemporary productions, horror comes comes from a universe that is alien to that of human beings, unknown. And the monstrous creature is the invader, the miscegenated, the gay, the strange other of liquid times, quoted Bauman. So at that time, when Lovecraft wrote, and we can see that in the works of what we call, for example, invasion literature, the invasion literature. Horror was external. It was foreign to citizens and attacked them. The horror effects on the characters, they came from the monster's strangeness. And today, especially after September 11th, Gothic literature, including Lovecraft's works, can be read and can be associated with the anxiety, the fear that are established in social life. And that involve, for example, our insecurity in relation to the different other, and the lack of knowledge about that other. The lack of knowledge, that's what happened in Lovecraft. So this apprehension and global insecurity that we have today in contemporary society shows us that the integrity of people, they are not guaranteed. So that's why Lovecraft's works can be read under a contemporary perspective. It's current, it's so present. Lovecraft's creatures are strange to our knowledge, far from our access. They are others that we see on the streets. They are the others. Are these people that we see on the streets, strange ones, are they monsters? We don't know. They may be, or they may be simply constructed as monsters, like Middle East. I don't know if India belongs to Middle East officially, but it's Middle East. It reminds me of Edward Said. He wrote a very famous book, Orientalism. He has so Middle East is projected to the world as a symbol of evil that endangers United States and all the Western countries. And the Western countries, what are they? They would be, in the tone of their talks, essentially civilized, benevolent, good. I don't like that word essentially, but it's what he said, Edward Said, in his book. That's one way. That's one way to read Lovecraft's monsters. Now,
I think many people, even in America, I'll tell you, I'm sorry to say it, but in America, people have a very bad understanding of history here, as you know, because it's just not taught very well, and there's a lot of ignorance. I don't think people realize how incredibly racist the entire culture of Lovecraft's era was. I mean, unbelievably so, in a way that we can't even begin to imagine, even today, when we see all this horrible stuff going on with Trump and the white supremacists and all these people. What was happening from the late roughly from 1890 to say 1920, there was an enormous influx of immigrants from all over the world, really, and not just from the good white races, as they were called, from England or Germany or France, wherever, but from Southern Europe, from Latin America, South America, Asia. Very different, both in appearance and in culture, and a huge influx. 15 million people in that era. At a time when the United States population was only about 100 million, so a huge number of people, and the so-called old white Americans were seriously disturbed that their own culture was slipping away from them as a result of all these immigrants coming in, and that's part of what fueled Lovecraft's racism. He was not at all unusual in worrying about what's going to happen, with all these people coming in who don't look like us, you really have to study that period to understand that, and that is why the United States passed a succession of immigration restriction laws right around that time, especially 1924, severe immigration restriction law that radically reduced immigration. For 40 or 50 years, it was not overturned until about 1965, and in fact, my own family, which came here from India in 1963, was actually lucky to get in because we had, my mother and father also, who came later, were professors, and they had to have a sponsorship from the institution where they were going to be teaching at, the University of Illinois. Otherwise, they would not have gotten in, and certainly myself and my two sisters, who were obviously quite young at the time, would not have gotten in either, because the restrictions were so tight, and only were liberalized some years later. And of course, nowadays, this election, I'll tell you, part of it is the fear. I'm sorry to say it, but the fear of white Americans, some white Americans, of what they call the great replacement. That's the term that they're starting to use now. Because by around the year 2040, whites will be a minority in the United States. And that is totally freaking them out. It is totally freaking some people out. And this is what the last gasp of white supremacy, I think, in this country. But I think, I'm sorry to say it, but they're on their way out. We're taking over, I'll tell you. We're taking over.
In Brazil, we are a black country where a black, and at the same time, that's a paradox, a racist country. How can we understand that?
Yeah.
Let's see. Would you like to have a 5 minutes pause? A 5 minute pause? Yeah?
Yeah, let's do just a couple of minutes, maybe. We'll get up and stretch my legs a little bit.
Okay, so we're going to have a 5 minutes pause, okay? And then you come back just for Joshi to eat something or go into the bathroom. Okay?
All right. Very good.
Pessoal, vamos fazer 5 minutos de intervalo rapidinho, tá bom? 5 minute break. Okay, we're back. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you continue talking about Lovecraft?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, you wrote a book, which I read. It's called A Dreamer and a Visionary, H.P. Lovecraft in his time. Do you remember that?
Oh yes. Well, I'll explain that.
You have many, so sometimes.
Well, that's actually an abridged version of my my full biography, I Am Providence.
Yeah. In this book, Dreamer and a Visionary, you also talk about the insignificance of the human beings in the face of ancestral forces that characterizes Lovecraftian cosmic horror.
I think you got disconnected here. I can't hear you anymore. Are you there? Hello? I'm not seeing you or hearing you anymore. I hope we are just having small technical difficulties here. I'm sure he'll be back soon.
I'm back. Maybe an internet problem. Did you manage to hear my question, or should I repeat?
No. Why don't you repeat that?
Yeah, I said that in your book, you said that cosmic horror there involves a metaphysical position, ethical position, and an aesthetic position. Mm-hmm. How does cosmic horror involve these three things? Could you explain?
Okay, yeah, this is quite complicated. I actually wrote an entire book on Lovecraft's philosophy called H.P. Lovecraft: The Decline of the West, that I go into great detail about this. But in short, the short answer is this. Cosmic horror is based upon a metaphysic that Lovecraft evolved early on in his life, actually quite early, you know, when he started studying science in particular, chemistry, astronomy, and then later on physics and geology and a number of the sciences. He came to the conclusion that indeed all human life, all Earth life, is utterly insignificant in the vast stretches of the cosmos. The cosmos is, he believed, infinite or almost infinite in size and also infinite in time. The idea of the Big Bang hadn't emerged then, of course. At that time, it was a later discovery. But nevertheless, we're dealing with immense gulfs of time and space, and here's our little planet that is of utter inconsequence within the entire scope of space and time. That is a fact. I mean, that is unquestionably a fact. And Lovecraft used that as a basis for rejecting organized or conventional religion. He says religion, every religion, really speaking, but particularly Christianity and the other major religions, assume that human life or humanity is at the center of the universe, when it is obviously not the case, and that we are under the specific attention of a benevolent God, and there's absolutely no evidence of that either. So that's the metaphysical basis for that belief. It has an ethical corollary in the sense that how do you deal with the sense of our own significance, our insignificance? How does a human being come to terms with that? Well, what Lovecraft did was to apply to tradition, and he admitted that that's just a personal solution. He says, history and tradition, has no particular meaning in the cosmic sphere, but it does have meaning to us as human beings living in a historical continuum. And so he appealed to the past. He enjoyed thinking that he was living in the past, or at least drawing upon features of the past. I mean, he had a great admiration for the 18th century for a variety of reasons. And he wanted to conduct himself in a gentlemanly fashion, which even then at that time was considered, sort of class conscious and antiquated, because, popular movements were coming up and the idea of the gentleman was becoming pretty outmoded. But that's how he lived personally. When he came to writing weird fiction, he says, all right, I will use this as the basis of my of how I want to write. And so that his characters are meant to perceive the insignificance of their own existence within the cosmic realm, and that is acutely terrifying to them. And he does that not only by showing the vast gulfs of space and time. I think At the Mountains of Madness is the great example of that, but also The Shadow Out of Time and a number of other instances, but in showing how these narrators converted or began with a failure to understand this principle, but then the events of the story made them realize that this is how things are, and then their entire worldview is shattered. The Call of Cthulhu is a great example of that. And I think that is a very powerful tool that by which Lovecraft conveyed this sense of horror. And I think, going back to some of the things we've said before, the idea of the Gothic monster and all that, Lovecraft was writing at a very critical time in the history of Gothic and supernatural fiction. By the time he started writing in the 1920s, a lot of these motifs, especially the vampire, and the werewolf and the ghost, had been done over and over and over again. They were played out to his mind, not only because there were so many previous examples, but because the advance of science had rendered these creatures totally unusable, even in the space of a work of fiction. He just didn't think that he could convey the sense of disbelief in these entities, at this time in history. So he had to create his own monsters. That's why he appealed to the monsters from outer space. All his great entities, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, supposedly come from the depths of space, where things may be very different, where science, as it were, or the natural law may be very different from what natural law is here. Because he felt that is the only way for a mature audience who knows science, who knows philosophy, can really get a kick out of it, the frisson, as the French say, of the shudder of supernatural horror, whereas the standard ghost and werewolf aren't capable of that anymore.
Very nice. Renata, I think Renata made a question. We're going to answer the questions in the end, at least if time allows some of them. But I think he partially answered your question, if Renata is there. Okay.
Yeah, speaking of Lovecraft, I mean, in my estimation, horror changed quite a bit after Lovecraft died in 1937. What do you think happened with weird fiction after Lovecraft's death? You have writers like Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson and Shirley Jackson appearing to do very different things, perhaps bringing horror back to the human scale. What do you make of this development in weird fiction?
This question demands some reflection. Yeah, it's not easy. In the USA of the early 20th century, when Lovecraft wrote, we know that there were lots of changes. Yeah, the process of mechanization, technological, and industry expansion that was started after the period before. It was called a Long Depression in the 1870s. And then these changes were responsible for the urban growth in America. And so there were many changes, the development of the press, the expansion of the railways, and the creation of industries, and these increased the consumption of goods and services. And with these changes, we know there were changes in the values. Many values were changed. And we have that today too. So as a consequence, tensions arose. It was natural. And these tensions were usually related to a feeling of rejection of the new paradigm that was being established. to that fast daily life that was coming to the new values, and to the immigrants, as you said before. So the immigrants, they were commonly living in ghettos and many cities, big cities. They represented for many American people a threat to their insecurity, to their security, to their stability. And in his tales, Lovecraft often brings the image of decaying communities and mentally disturbed characters, usually due to that contact with the monster's other or any manifestation of that monster. So his works bring up creatures who are associated with distant worlds and are endowed with habits and unconventional ways of life. They are monstrous. So it was an era, the time he wrote, marked by complex relationships that involve the conception of the non-Western. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Lovecraft's work, the monsters other are creatures that embody horror, as I said before. And at the same time, they are cause of apprehension, attraction sometimes on an emotional level. These creatures, for example, the Elder Ones, they are unknown, unknowable, alien to human knowledge. They are beyond our capacity of comprehension or interaction. We cannot interact with them. Mm. So his weird fiction is not only the monster or the frightening. That is the point. His literature is it's not only to frighten, but it's what we call cosmic horror. It involves a philosophical basis, a metaphysical vision, what you have just said, as you said. Yeah. So after Lovecraft, while the world experienced the two great wars and many written works, we can see that they presented narratives whose monsters were more, they were different. They promoted more dislike, repulsion. There is no uncanny, there is no objection. There is no level of attraction as the most part of that. I mean, not today, soon after he wrote, the years after, yeah? So they are usually creatures that cause fear, they cause oppression, disgust. There is no metaphysical basis for that fear. I have many examples. For example, Wakefield, he wrote a novel, a tale, it's a tale, kind of novella, called The Red Lodge. And we have the ghost there that terrorized the artist, the character, his wife, if I'm not wrong, his son as well, during their vacation. Besides that, for example, in many Gothic works after the Second World War and after Lovecraft, there is a greater recurrence of scientific or technical explanation about the supernatural. Mm-hmm. What we don't have in Lovecraft, there is a kind of renounce of superstitions, maybe culturally shared profiles. For example, you mentioned Richard Matheson, yeah? Joshi, are you there?
Yeah.
Richard Matheson. We can see in his... Yeah, I Am Legend. So in I Am Legend, we know it tells the story of Neville, the only survivor of, and he was not infected by a bacterium that turns people into vampires. Right, so Neville himself, he seems to suspect of what he calls cliches. He refers to that characterization of vampires based on data that was not scientifically proven. Mm-hmm. So the credibility generated by the monsters and their likelihood, it was reinforced by the association between such creatures and a scientific explanation. For example, if you come to the present, not to the present, but if you talk about Shirley Jackson, you mentioned Shirley Jackson. Mm. She has a novel called The Haunting of Hill House, which now was adapted into the series. Dr. Montaigne, he's investigating the paranormal cases in the novel in different parts of the world, and then he's in search of scientific explanations. And then he invites some people, sensitive people, to stay there in the haunted house and for a paranormal study. So these monsters, they are closer. That's another point. They are closer after Lovecraft. They are more palpable. Maybe there is an influence of science there. They can be domestic in the case of Shirley Jackson's. Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there were market forces in popular literature at that time that were leading to these kinds of changes. The pulp magazines, Weird Tales, Astounding Stories, and others, these were where these works of cosmic horror, not just by Lovecraft, but by his friends, Robert Bloch and August Derleth and all the other people, appeared. But those pulp magazines basically died out by Weird Tales lasted all the way till 1954, but that was an exception. The others had died out much earlier. And what happened then was that the science fiction magazines, the so-called digest magazines, took over. The paperback book came into existence, which really hadn't flourished before. And so weird fiction really didn't have any places to appear. It had to be masqueraded as science fiction, which is what Matheson did, and Bradbury in some ways did also. Or it had to masquerade as crime suspense fiction, which is why Robert Bloch wrote Psycho in 1959, a great work, which I do believe is a work of horror, even though it's purely non-supernatural, but the element of terror is definitely there. So a lot of this was driven by what the market was now offering to these writers. And I think there was a sense in which, in fact, we know this to be the case, that some people felt that Lovecraft's emphasis on cosmic horror was, departed from our understanding of humanity. I don't believe that's the case, but that was the perception, and they wanted to bring horror fiction back down to the level of the human, and that's why you have people like Shirley Jackson and Bradbury and Matheson writing in on a relatively human scale. Shirley Jackson is a fascinating figure, I must say. I've always had an interest in her, and she was regarded as a mainstream writer, of course, and she is for the most part a mainstream writer in the standard definition of the term, except in cases like Haunting of Hill House and of course The Lottery. But The Lottery is also purely non-supernatural. There's nothing supernatural in that story too, but it's definitely a work of horror. Because that story appeals again to the past. It appeals to folklore. It is the sense of creating a scapegoat, to benefit the crops, which is an old motif that goes back, tens of thousands of years in humanity. And the terror of that story is that this kind of thing still goes on, in this community. But otherwise,
I don't know if you agree, but if we consider the supernatural and weird writers, both in the USA and in England, I see there is a kind of gap between Victorian period and modern period.
Yep.
Right. And after Lovecraft, I'm not sure if we had a prolific. You were talking about that movement. Yeah, I'm not sure if we had a prolific American writer until the 1970s when Stephen King started, for example. Maybe Richard Matheson or Shirley Jackson, but we know that some of their works are part of a different genres or cannot be simply considered weird. So we also had Robert Aikman, who may be considered one of the only voices there in the 60s. But in general, I see no philosophical, metaphysical, or even ontological basis, which in the case of Lovecraft helped his weird literature to create one of its most important elements, the atmosphere, and its effect over the characters and the reader. So in general terms, I don't know if you agree, but it seems to me that many modern weird works after Lovecraft seem to focus more on frightening the reader. Maybe that's why some of them were successful when they were adapted into the screen, because cinema is very visual.
Oh, yes.
Maybe many of them are bestsellers or blockbusters, so they focus more on the emotion caused and are not worried, for example, about touching human beings deeply, their significance, or about the universe. So they don't seem to be based on a notion of reality that makes us reflect on our existence. That will appear obviously again after in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, or in Tananarive Deu's Joplin's Ghost, but it's a different perspective because it's more related to racial questions and ghosts of the past. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. This we're talking about this horror boom, as I've called it, and other people too, in the 1970s. It was I lived through this phenomenon. It was fascinating to see. First of all, you had in 1971 you had William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, and also Thomas Tryon's The Other, which I think is a superb piece of work. But anyway, those two books, 1971, were #1 and #2 on the U.S. bestseller list for a good part of that year. I don't know that has ever happened where two works of horror fiction, were at the very top of the bestseller list. And then Stephen King came along in 1974 with Carrie and Salem's Lot and all these other books that he's written, especially in the 80s and 90s. Was the dominant force in publishing in that era. But it was, in my estimation, the best-selling phenomenon was a very different thing from. There was a higher grade of weird fiction being written at that time. Also, that this is also the era when Ramsey Campbell emerged in the 1970s. When Ted Klein started coming along, and then a little later in this late 80s and into the 90s, Thomas Ligotti. Those three writers in particular, I think, I regard them as sort of the literary side of the whole horror boom. Of course, they didn't get nearly the attention that King and Straub and Anne Rice did, but
about that boom you're talking about of the 70s and 80s. With writers such as the ones you have just said, Stephen King, Clive Barker, Straub, and Rice, and others. Do you think that in a sense, or in what sense, was this horror boom is a return to the older Gothic tradition, both in form and in content?
Oh, absolutely it is. It is really a revival of the Gothic. I mean, okay, King has been influenced to some degree by Lovecraft, but to my mind, not very significantly. Anne Rice, very, very little. Straub, almost nothing. Clive Barker, almost nothing. They were fostering, whether by accident or design, a more popular type of weird fiction that would be more accessible to the average reader. They were not writing for kind of a highbrow audience by any means, and that's what the old-time Gothic writers also did. Their works were among the first bestsellers in the English-speaking world. Anne Radcliffe, in particular, was a huge bestseller in her day, but was not all that highly regarded critically. And these writers aren't either, frankly, and shouldn't be, in all honesty. They are popular writers, and therefore, to appeal to a popular audience, you have to draw upon relatively conventional motifs, the vampire in Salem's Lot, things like that. Even Peter Straub resurrected the old ghost, which is one of the oldest motifs in literature in ghost story. Well done book, very well done book, but nevertheless, it's a pretty standard motif. Clive Barker is a little more innovative, at least he was in his early work. And I think he gained popularity just because he was way over the top. I mean, his work is so full of gore and blood and things. It startled people that he could write in this sort of flamboyant manner. It really took people aback. I remember those books coming out and the impression they created in 84, 85, 86. But I agree with you. I don't think there's a lot of metaphysical or even aesthetic thought behind these things. They're relatively conventional books that are meant to appeal to a wide audience and did appeal. Although I think so many people tried to write in this vein in that era. I mean, there were too many books coming out of this sort, and the movement basically collapsed upon itself. Through sheer overuse, I think.
Very nice. The good thing is that we started talking about Greek monsters, about Beowulf, about Macbeth, and now we're coming to the present. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the great ways in which horror has been accessible to a modern audience. When I refer to modern, I'm referring all the way from like 1950s onward, is through film. In fact, I think film, the horror and science fiction films of the 50s and 60s might have set the stage for this horror boom, which led me to think that you think of all these slasher monsters from the 80s, Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. Can you read them in social terms? What impact or what is their, how do they reflect social anxieties of that period?
Yeah, I talked about that. Maybe I think I talked about that in my book. I mentioned not so deeply, but yeah, these are two monsters that were our first Gothic elements, at least for me in my childhood. So it was my first contact with monsters, my contact with Jason Voorhees and Fred Krueger. And in their films, I really see some relation. I indeed see some relation between these monsters and the social historical context. So my answer for that question will be based on one very important point: the fact that they were not unknown like Lovecraft's monsters. They provided a more visual, a more violent, and maybe less psychological horror. So the emphasis there is on the monster as a figure who is well known. They personify horror, and the monster is very clear. So these monsters, they inspired many questions from the critics at the time they appeared on TV. So many of the critics saw these productions, these movies, as a way that showed male, for example, male killers, because that's what they are, who used extreme violence against women, punishing them only for being women. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting if we consider the political and social context, because in the 1980s, who was the president? Ronald Reagan.
Yes.
With his very large ears. So he was elected the president of USA, and his image and his politics, he was very conservative. They personified that conservatism originated by the crisis of the values and economic recession of the previous decade. So the election of Reagan gave a kind of symbolic end to the so-called permissive and aimless era of the 70s. So people were more interested in a return to traditional values, family values, religious values. Yeah. So if we take a look at Jason and Freddy Krueger, we can have many different interpretations, but we can see they are supernatural, serial killers who kill people, and usually disobedient people or promiscuous young people in suburbs, far from the city, in camps, during their dreams, in the case of Freddy Krueger. So we may also remember that these creatures, they were once human, and human beings that were members of a less privileged social classes. So that what does that suggest? Maybe that the harm they cause is in some way part of a revenge, for example. This is another reading. Yeah, it would be a way of social justice. Yeah. So in this sense, they return from death their return would be a kind of punishment of higher social classes for what they have done. If we consider the crisis of the late 1970s in the USA, and in Europe as well, some people could have thought that socialism in America would be the solution, which in a way explains the horror that emerged from the proletariat with the aim of killing the rich ones, the bourgeois, in French. So there's maybe another interpretation. But what is clear is that the monster was identifiable. It was manifest,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, believe me, I lived in New York City during the mid-'80s all the way through the 90s up till about 2001. And, believe me, crime we had a very high crime rate, both in a lot of the major cities, New York, Detroit, Washington, D.C., many other places. And I think a lot of these movies are meant to capitalize upon, or at least to play upon standard middle-class fears of crime that is out of control, especially in the big cities. Crime has gone way down now, but some demagogues like Trump still try to make an issue of that. Didn't work this time because people know that crime is not as out of control as it was. And even there were some very good TV shows. One of my favorite TV shows of that era was called Hill Street Blues. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, but very, very well done police show that came to grips in a very sensitive but powerful way with rampant crime in the big cities. And I think these movies, the horror films, also had there was an element of that as well in that context.
Yeah, I didn't live in the 1970s, but I was not there. But many people associated the increase of social inequalities and the crisis of the 70s with the new liberal and capitalist tendencies. There was also that tendency. So in the 1980s, the appearance of monsters in these kind of slasher films, what we call the face on display, they show themselves. They come from the fact that there was no doubt about who was the enemy in social terms. Because socialism was already falling during the 80s, so it was no longer a threat. But capitalism could be seen in this sense as a monster. So in social terms, people's values were related to we know that the American dream, the professional success and consumption of goods. And if we look at Jason and Freddy Krueger's movies, we see that the visual violence, the visual blood of the deaths is almost always proportional to the level of excesses, to the level of consumption, to the level of permissiveness, and the victim's sexuality. That's what happens. But coming more to the present, I have a very interesting question I'd like to ask you. In my book, O Gótico e seus Monstros, Gothic and its Monsters, you wrote the preface. You reminded us about the fact that the popularity of horror writing in the work of Stephen King, Clive Barker, and others, and the increase in sophistication of horror as manifested in film, graphic novels, and other media, have finally led critics and scholars to explore Gothic more deeply. And we can see that clearly when we face the large bibliography we have about canonical works in comparison to Gothic fiction. It's really forgotten. So why was scholarship on this genre, on Gothic, strangely lacking during decades? How can we explain the low esteem in which the genre was regarded for centuries?
Very complex question. And I think part of the answer is that, especially in the Anglo-American civilization, works that portrayed this kind of horror were looked down upon from a moral standpoint because they felt that there was glorifying violence and horror and things like that, and therefore it was regarded as below the level of literature. In spite of the fact that it is quite clear that the great majority of literature is, I mean, you look at Oedipus, the play Oedipus the King by Sophocles, full of blood and horror and all sorts of things. Shakespeare, full of blood and horror. But these works of literature were regarded as somehow morally tainted and therefore not worthy of consideration by critics who only regarded works of social realism, whether it be Jane Austen or the Brontes or Dickens, and then all the way up into the 20th century with Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, those kinds of writers. And there's another aspect to it too, and that is that especially in the 20th century, a lot of this literature appeared in these pulp magazines because it couldn't appear anywhere else. The mainstream magazines, Saturday Evening Post or whatever, would not publish this kind of work anymore. In fact, they never did. Although in England it wasn't so bad. There were mainstream magazines in England that would publish ghost stories and things like that. But in the United States, very little, and therefore critics believed that this kind of literature was only popular literature. It was literature for the masses, even though you had the example of Henry James, who is certainly not a writer of the masses, writing many, many ghost stories. And Lovecraft, even though he published in the pulps, was a really kind of a highbrow writer. His language is difficult. His conceptions are hard to grasp sometimes. I mean, he's a compellingly readable writer. I think many people have found him very readable, but he's not an easy writer. Along, somebody like Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan. Those are genuine works of popular literature that are very low on the literary scale. But nevertheless, that kind of prejudice emerged because of the origin of this material or the publication of this material in these cheap magazines that would literally crumble to dust in a few years because they were made on such bad paper and things like that.
Do you also think that this prejudice? Sorry. Do you also think that, or have you ever read or reflected that these rejection or prejudice sometimes comes from the ability of Gothic tale to excite in the reader's mind a strong fear? I mean, it would be for some, Gothic would be considered a return to pre-modern times, and then it would be too much sensual, it would lack intellectual content, deepness.
Yeah, I think a lot of critics, even today, don't really know how to deal with this kind of literature because they're so used to dealing with the literature of realism. They don't understand the rhetoric of horror fiction, of supernatural fiction, where things are written symbolically and metaphorically, but are still trying to convey serious messages about the human condition. It takes a long understanding, and reading of the literature to kind of get it and to figure out what it is trying to say. It's not just an expression of violence and arid supernaturalism, escapism. That's the standard term. This is supposed to be escapist literature, but it doesn't have to be. Some of it is, of course, but there's a lot of bad mainstream literature that is also pretty much escapist because it really doesn't reflect reality either. Things started to change, in my estimation, in the 1970s, maybe even earlier than that, but certainly by the 70s, because science fiction started to become critically respectable. Critics saw some science fiction writers, whether it be Arthur C. Clarke or Philip K. Dick or even Asimov to some degree, as genuine, that they had something to say as writers. They were just not writing stuff about spaceships and outer space. So when science fiction became respectable, eventually weird fiction sort of drew upon that, and then we had theorists like Svetlana Todorov and other writers who started taking weird fiction more seriously. Even now, though, I think weird fiction is here. I mean, it has arrived as a critically viable mode of literature. But I still think that many mainstream critics just are not comfortable with it and don't really know how to deal with it.
Very nice. I don't know how to pronounce Todorov's first name, but
Svetan, I guess.
We never know. As time is, we have almost more than 1 hour and a half. I have maybe one more question from me to you, and from you to me would be good. Just
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask. Okay, so the horror boom is basically over. We don't have very many best-selling horror novels anymore, although King is still writing, of course. What do you think now is the dominant mode of horror fiction these days, when it is not a best-selling phenomenon?
Very nice. We know that there is a lot of Lovecraft influence on contemporary writers. Stephen King's literature, he's very influenced by Lovecraft. Mike Mignola's, if we talk about the comic books, graphic novels, Mike Mignola's. We have Brian Lumley's works, including the ones that expand the universe created by Lovecraft. So there are many other examples of the influence of cosmic horror in the 21st century. The large number of films adaptations that in the last years, including Lovecraft's Color Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage, the production of, for example, related to the Lovecraft's works, the series, for example, like HBO's Lovecraft Country. So, and the growth of the academic studies on his literature are examples of this influence. But we know that also there's also a kind of a resurgence, as you said, resurgence of the weird fiction from the 80s on, under the label, many labels, in fact, but one of them is New Weird. Maybe you have read about that, and you have written about that, which continues until the 21st century. However, I don't think, Joshi, we can say that there is a return to cosmic horror as a recurring genre that will mark our time. About the weird and the Gothic productions nowadays, there are obviously some tendencies to portray, for example, hauntings, aliens, zombies. I talk about that in my book, especially in the movies and in literature. But because these productions are often related to the apprehensions, to the anxieties facing the contemporary times and uncertainties. But although there are certain recurring questions, themes, elements, it is a complex period, and the production of monsters does not follow well-defined models or parameters. So an important thing we should consider is that Gothic seems to reach the 21st century without any manifest, without a collective movement. So Gothic fiction comes to the current time as a kind of, I mentioned that term in my book, a juxtaposition of individualities. And what justifies that juxtaposition of individualities are the many themes that coexist in contemporary times. We have terrorism, we have environmental problems, catastrophes, phobias that involve that contact with the different others, all the fears that are associated with the risk of wars, nuclear wars, attacks, biotechnology. So in this sense, in the 21st century world, we have fluidity, unpredictability, patterns, moderns, these paradigms, they are always changing all the time. And the ideas, they are fragmented. So even though the different, the threat, the marginal, that is the monster, even though it continues to disturb the laws, in today's world, and even though fiction brings aspects that characterize the traditional monsters sometimes because they are still here, after Lovecraft's time, and I believe the contemporary Gothic is recreated, rewritten every production. So it seems to me that this is the trend of weird and Gothic productions around the world in recent years, not only literature, but in video games and movies. So it's a style, just to finish, that cannot be reduced to a specific standards. And monsters cannot be analyzed only according to their relation with the classical models, for example. The more, that is something that sums up my talk. The more Gothic fiction gets closer to the present, the more it tends to change. The more fluid, the less standardized it becomes. That's the impression I have.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what works do indeed survive 50 or 100 years from now. We won't be here. I certainly won't, but it'll be very interesting. I do think one of the leading writers of our field currently is Caitlyn Kiernan. She's a transgender writer, brilliant writer, works in horror, works in fantasy, works in science fiction even, but the bulk of her work is horror, and she has been profoundly influenced, although not at all in any sort of obvious way. She has transmuted that Lovecraft influence into works that are very much her own, and really, to my mind, the best writer in this field right now. But there are many other goods out there.
Very good. I have to answer some of the audience's question. This last question of mine is a question that a friend of mine, Dr. Swellen, she asked me to make. Okay, so since her research also involves Alan Moore's work. So in Alan Moore's graphic novel, Providence, especially in issue number 12, there is a representation of you as the Joshi, as a character. And it's not any coincidence, you are a literary critic on Lovecraft in the novel. So what is your impression of Alan Moore's Providence comic book, especially about the representation that is made of yourself as a character?
Well, I'm certainly not about to say anything bad about Alan Moore. I was very flattered that he chose to depict me in this work. And I'll be honest with you, I actually haven't read the whole comic. It's funny how this happened. You know, Alan Moore lives in England. He doesn't use a computer. He doesn't have email, doesn't have internet, nothing like that. He's very old-fashioned in that regard. So what happened was, at some convention, I believe it was one of these so-called Necronomicon conventions in Providence, Rhode Island. I think 2015 it was. Some friend of Alan Moore came up to me just on the street, and he said, "Oh, you know, Alan Moore has a great admiration for your work. He's read your biography and all this other stuff, and he'd like you to get in touch with him." So he gave me his phone number. All right, so I had this long phone number from to call him in England, and when I got home, I did call him, and we spoke for more than an hour. It was great fun. Wonderful man. I don't know if he had already written that comic about me yet, or maybe not, but whatever it was. We then exchanged a few letters, very interesting. I wouldn't say I'm, deeply in touch with him right now, but all I can say is I am very flattered that he chose to cite me in his work. And the weird thing was that he included me wearing this sort of jacket that I actually wear. He must have seen a photograph of me somewhere wearing this jacket, because he captures it exactly. It's amazing. I have it right there, hanging on my hat rack, right in the other room. Amazing. I'm not sure how I actually figure in this work. I clearly understand my role in it, but all I can say is I'm immensely flattered, and I take my hat off to Alan. He's a profound student of Lovecraft.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sue Ellen is here. She's in the audience. I read the comics very fast. This issue, and we have three characters there. Joshi, three main characters. At least in the scenes, you appear. There is a woman, Meryl Breers, and a man called Perman, and they may be interpreted as three different reactions to Lovecraft's work, and different reactions. So you are the one who is the literary critic, so who considers the stories and the philosophy, and who analyze his life and in the context, literary aspects. As you said, now you don't believe those monsters exist, so you are that character in the graphic novel. But Carl Perman, he would represent those who want a more proactive posture, similar to maybe to August Derleth's mythos. So it's a little bit different. And the woman, Mary Breers, she would represent those who accept Lovecraft stories at a more metaphysical, personal, or spiritual level. I don't know if Sue Ellen had that vision, but maybe I will talk about that to her, okay? It's not easy to understand the graphic novel as well. So now we have 13 minutes left, and then it's going to be over. I'll choose some. Let's see if we have questions here on the. In the end, we're going to have a raffle of a book of mine, okay? A copy of my book. So, pessoal, quem tiver participado do sorteio, preenche aí o formulário que está na descrição do vídeo, tá bom? O sorteio do meu livro, capa dura, com envio grátis, ok? Let me see here. Lots of Talia Silva is asking, in your opinion, what is the greatest women's contribution in Gothic literature, apart from Mary?
aside from Mary Shelley, wow, there are a lot of women, great women writers. In the late 19th century, there's so many great Victorian women's writers who wrote ghost stories. You have so many of them. Rhoda Broughton and Amelia B. Edwards, and just the list goes on and on. They all did really good work. I actually put together a volume of Edith Nesbit's work. She was a British writer from the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. She did some fine work in two different volumes. One of them simply called Fear, the other one called Grim Tales, I believe. And in the U.S., Mary Wilkins Freeman wrote a classic volume called The Wind in the Rosebush and Other Tales of the Supernatural. And she wrote more stories than that. And I assembled a volume of her supernatural writings too. But frankly, Mary Shelley tops them all. I mean, Frankenstein is eternally interpretable. It says so much. There is no, you cannot exhaust that work in terms of its influence and in terms of its the depth that it conveys. And Anne Rice, I think the earlier work of Anne Rice is certainly not to be despised. I think Interview with a Vampire, The Vampire Lestat, and even stuff like later, The Tale of the Body Thief actually does rely a little bit on Lovecraft in terms of its idea of switching bodies, and she explicitly mentions Lovecraft in there. So the early Anne Rice is pretty good. I think the later work of her work is not so good, but yeah, they're fabulous works.
Very nice. These questions are yours. I have talked too much, and the star here is you. It's not me. So Renata is a friend of mine. She asked here, I was curious. In the beginning of the live, Emílio said that he doesn't see Gothic in a broader sense, like she also sees. And I mean, Emílio sees the Gothic in a broader sense, but Joshi doesn't seem to see Gothic in a broader sense. How would he see Gothic, the manifestations of Gothic, after Lovecraft in this sense?
Well, as I say, my point is merely the use of the term. I actually don't like the use of the term Gothic to denote this entire branch of literature, because I think it's misleading, because especially after Poe created such a radical change in the whole movement because of his emphasis both on the short story and also on the element of psychological terror. That radically changed the whole way that this kind of literature was written. More so in England than in the United States than in England and elsewhere, because the Gothic tendency still went on in England for quite a while with people like Edward Bulwer-Lytton and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who is a classic Gothic writer from the mid to later 19th century. But as we have just mentioned, yeah, the best-selling horror of the 1970s, again, probably not intentionally, but did go back to a lot of the motifs of that old-time Gothic literature. The haunted house, the ghost, things like that. But again, that because that was a popular type of motif that those writers like King and Straub and others believed would draw them a wide audience.
Yeah, very nice. About the female writers, Jacqueline said Shirley Jackson is certainly a great name too. And Ana Carolina said we have Mariana Enriquez here in South America. Very good. Felipe, there was a question here from Felipe. Let me see here. He's asking, what do you think about the film adaptations of Lovecraft in general terms?
Well, yeah, Lovecraft's not been very successful. I mean, or it's very, very hard to adapt Lovecraft, I think. I still believe that in spite of the virtues of the recent Color Out of Space film, which had a lot of good things in it, there was a version that was done about 10 years earlier called it was a German production, Die Farbe, which is simply The Color. And in fact, oddly enough, it was the director is Vietnamese, Huan Vu. Superb film. I think that is the best Lovecraft adaptation out there. It's hard to find because it didn't get widely distributed, but if you look hard enough for it, you can find it. Otherwise, sometimes Lovecraft works better in short films or in films that are only indirectly based on Lovecraft. John Carpenter's film In the Mouth of Madness is a very fine film that draws somewhat on Lovecraft and somewhat on other things too. And there are other things of that kind. For example, I just recently saw the film, I think it was called Underwater, just a couple of years ago. Really, really powerful film. Clearly influenced by Lovecraft. And of course, the greatest film of all in that regard is Alien. There is no question that Alien was significantly influenced by Lovecraft, not only because H.R. Giger did the set designs, but But Dan O'Bannon, who I think was, I don't know if he wrote the screenplay, was intimately involved. Dan O'Bannon has been a long-time Lovecraft fan, and there's a lot of Lovecraft in that film.
Joshi.
I'm not hearing you now. But... Hello, still there?
So that's it. It fell again. Sorry. So to finish, there is just one left. Marcel, he wants to know about your opinion about the possibility of the existence of any type of painting or art, non-narrative art that works with cosmic horror. For example, H.R. Giger. Or Bersinko. I don't know him. But
that is the second name I don't know, but Giger is unquestionably cosmic horror, yeah, and deeply influenced by Lovecraft. Of course, he published 2 books called Necronomicon, so undoubtedly influenced by Lovecraft. You know, it's funny, yeah. I think cosmic art, actually, probably you'll find it best in the science fiction field rather than in the weird fiction field, and there is some great examples of that too. Whether it be in the old pulp magazines or even in contemporary work, but I'm not a great student of pictorial art, so I don't have all that much more to offer than that.
Very nice. So again, I'd like to thank the special audience we had here tonight, including my dear students, and to thank everyone who helped to make this moment happen. I'd like to give special thanks to Joshi for gently accepting the invitation, and to research groups to which I belong for the encouragement and for the prolific discussions we've had on Gothic these years. Okay? Thank you, Joshi.
It was wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and now in the end, we have the raffle to finish that live of my book, okay? I'll share here in fact, just 1 minute so that we can end up, okay? We had, in the forums, we had 45 answers, okay? We had 45 answers here, just a minute. So I will number let me show you. I will number from 1 to 45. It's an app from the cell phone. Okay. And then I'll show you here let me see if I know how to do that. I will share that. Can you see that there? It's the list of people who filled the form.
Okay.
So here we have it's in the order they filled the form. So the first one is Adriana, for example. The second one is Alexander. Oh, it seems they are in the alphabetic order. How can I do that now? Let me see here. They weren't supposed to be in the alphabetic order. Oh God, what I'm gonna do now? So I'll consider the telephone numbers who appear here, okay? Yeah, I consider that alphabetic order. I'll raffle it now, okay? Can you see here? 13, which was Friday.
13. Lucky 13.
It's a good number for the Gothic, isn't it? So the winner, let me see here, who is the winner?
Yeah, these are not numbered now.
Oh, God. Emerson Ricardo de Souza, Brasil. Okay? After Emerson is the winner of a book, a copy of my book, Góticos e seus Monstros, which will be published in the beginning of the year. I'll have contact with Emerson to talk about the delivery, okay? So thank you very much, Joshi. Thank you, everyone who was here, okay, tonight.
Yeah.
See you.
All right.
Bye-bye.